Good morning everyone, my name is Chantelle and I'm fortunate enough to have been based in Brighton and Sussex since 2015. I started out as an academic junior doctor at the local trust and went on to do my Master of Research using lean management to streamline patient pathways. And I soon recognised that actually we have environmental savings associated with these lean models of care where we're maximising our resource use. And I went on to develop my PhD here at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, evaluating ways to reduce the environmental impact of the products that we use within the surgical operating theatre. And subsequent to that, became a clinical lecturer in sustainable healthcare here at BSMS. And this next 10 minutes, it will be essentially a whistle-stop tour in terms of my research over this last 5 years, just to give you a flavour of what we've been up to. My research focuses on surgery, but why surgery? We're a really resource-intensive area of the hospital, and in fact my own research indicates that we contribute about 19% of all our carbon footprint within the NHS. That's 5.7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents, and our major specialties that contribute towards that are our general surgery, our trauma and orthopaedics, and as well our obstetrics and gynaecology. And within my systematic reviews, I found that actually there were three major areas that are contributing to this carbon footprint. It's the anaesthetic gases, which are potent greenhouse gases in and of themselves, as well as the maintenance of that theatre environment, so our energy use, and our consumables, that throwaway single-use culture. And that's an area that we can really have a lot of influence over. And on the right-hand side, you'll see an image of the plastics that are generated for a single operation, a simple operation to remove adenoids and tonsils, generating over 100 pieces of single-use plastic for that one operation. And within my research, I looked at the 5 most common operations in England and looked at the carbon footprint of the products. And what was most interesting then was the breakdown in terms of the contributions. And you'll notice that in red towards the bottom, that the lion's share relates to the production of the single-use items. There's further contributions in red towards the top from the packaging of those items. They're our real hotspot that we need to target. The next major source of emissions then was the sterilisation process for our reusables, followed by a much smaller contribution from waste. So that's really the problem space, but what can we do about this? And throughout society, really, we're operating on a linear economy model where we're extracting resources, we're using them once, and we're throwing them away. And we can apply circular economy principles instead to challenge that model and to really try to capture and maximise our uses of materials and energy throughout our processes. And you'll be very familiar with reduce, reuse, recycle as the sorts of areas that we can apply to actually reduce the environmental impact of the products that we use. And that reduction principle can really apply across whole patient pathways, looking at those opportunities to streamline and make sure that every single step adds value to our patients. We can also, we've got this tendency within healthcare to open things just in case, and that needs to be challenged. We need to make sure that we are only opening things that we truly use, and anything else is waste in its truest form. And when it comes to reusables, our highest form of evidence is something called a life cycle assessment, where we evaluate all of the emissions associated from the product journey from the raw material extraction through the manufacturing process, the distribution, the use phase, so including that sterilisation process, all the way through to the waste disposal. And systematic reviews have found that we can reduce 38 to 50% of our carbon footprint through switching from single-use items to reusables. And on the right-hand side, that's from my own publication with a colleague in New Zealand, where published in Lancet Planetary Health. And here you'll see in a whole array of different healthcare products and a whole array of different geographical contexts that actually the reusables have got a much preferable environmental footprint. But sometimes it's not possible for us to use an entirely reusable item, and rather than jumping to use something that's single use, we can actually look for those opportunities to use products that are majority reusable with a very small single use component. And in that study of the 5 operations, I looked at the removal of a gallbladder, and I found that actually 20% of the carbon footprint of those products related to just 3 items. So these are real hotspot items, and they were the single-use clip applier, single-use laparoscopic scissors, as well as the port. So these single-use items that were used for the keyhole surgery. And I did a more detailed study then to see what would happen if we switched those to hybrids that are predominantly reusable, and I found that we could reduce the carbon footprint by 75%. And if we were to scale that up across all removals of gallbladder in the UK, or in England in fact, this would save the equivalent of me driving over 11 million miles in an average petrol car. And it's really helpful for us to do life cycle costings when we do this sort of research to look at what is the financial implication, and here the savings were to the tune of £11 million per year. And you might have mentioned towards that start that we found that actually the main additional hotspot area was the sterilisation. So once we're making those reductions, once we've adopted reusable items, it's the sterilisation process that becomes the real bottleneck. And so I undertook some research to then see how can we optimise that process. And I found that we could reduce the carbon footprint by 1/3 through a combination of strategies. And they were about how we actually prepare our instruments in sets rather than as individually wrapped supplementary items, so individually wrapped items. We can maximise the actual loading of our decontamination machines, as well as using those strategies that you might expect, such as using renewable energy sources, as well as recycling of the sterile barrier systems that we use to actually house those instruments. And it's not only that, we can then look at those opportunities to extend those reusable items further in terms of maximising our resources and extending their lifespan, and rather than throwing away reusable equipment at the end of their usable life, we can then actually repair many of these items. And our most commonly repaired item is surgical scissors, and my own research found that we could reduce the carbon footprint by 20% through use of repair, and the cost savings then were around 1/3. And finally, and we're not going to solve things through recycling, but it is important that we get it right. And I found that the difference between us placing an item in our clinical waste, which gets sent for high temperature incineration, recycling actually reduced the carbon footprint by a 50-fold factor. And we're going to really maximise our benefit of recycling if we start to actually use recycled materials within our healthcare products themselves. So these are the various different strategies that my research found, but what happens when we start to stack these on top of each other? As applied to that initial study of the 5 operations, I found that through combining those strategies we could reduce the carbon footprint by around 1/3. And during the pandemic, I also undertook some research to look at the environmental impact of the personal protective equipment that we were using, finding in that first 6 months we generated the equivalent of over 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. And that's the same as me flying from London to New York 244 times each and every single day. But more importantly, I was looking at that mitigation strategy, and I found that we could actually reduce the environmental impact by 75% through a combination of measures, including those I've discussed, but also domestic manufacture, because we use a much higher proportion of renewable energy sources here versus where these items are traditionally manufactured, such as Mexico, Malaysia, and China. So that's hopefully a little bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of the research. It's not all about the research. We also spend time translating this into practice and policy. For example, the PPE work was taken up by the WHO, and I'm currently working with the Greener NHS to evaluate how we integrate these environmental impacts into product decisions. So thanks very much. I think that's about all I've got time for today.